Oh, okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, both people in the room and also people on Zoom. Welcome to the spring quarter at CDRL at Stanford. We're really excited to be kicking off our spring quarter series with Jake Grumbach, who's an assistant professor of political science at the University of Washington and a faculty associate with the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. Grumbach's research focuses broadly on the political economy of the United States, with an emphasis on public policy, racial and economic inequality, and American federalism and statistical methods. He'll be presenting research today from his forthcoming book, Laboratories Against Democracy, which is coming out when?
July 5th.
July 5th, mark your calendars. All right, thanks, Jake.
Thank you, Dee. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Thanks, Amy, for all of the behind-the-scenes organizing work. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to come. I know busy time at the beginning of the spring quarter, but I'm off this spring quarter, so I'm feeling great being here. But really appreciate you taking the time. I'm not exactly sure the format, but I'd be okay if people sort of interrupt with questions, but if it's better.
We usually say, but clarifying questions, yeah. Go ahead.
Sounds great.
We're not economists, we're not prepared.
That's right.
So my talk today is Laboratories of Democratic Backsliding. And as Dee mentioned, this is part based on the last third of my forthcoming book, but also there's a corresponding paper version that has a bit more of the stats in it. So the motivation for this project is the ongoing crisis of American democracy. We saw a manifestation of that crisis on January 6th, 2021 in the insurrection at the Capitol. And throughout really the post-2016 period, there's been a huge amount of focus on threats to democracy and potential democratic backsliding based in Washington, D.C., with a special focus on the executive branch. But the US system constitutionally has an extremely decentralized form of federalism that puts most constitutional and legal authority over democratic institutions like election administration, districting, and policing powers at the state level. And that's actually where I'm going to argue we can observe this crisis over the long term. So the roadmap summary is I developed this new quantitative time series measure of democratic performance at the state level between 2000 and 2018 that I call the State Democracy Index. And then I use that new measure, which is sort of based on cross-national measures of democracy, for example, from polity and varieties of democracy, right? I've looked at Hungary and Philippines and Brazil. Looking at the US states, I test the predictions of longstanding theories of why democracy expands or contracts based in partisan competition, polarization, demographic change and racial threat, or the group-based coalition of the contemporary Republican Party nationally. And I conclude really that statistics are really saying that the modern GOP does seem to pose a challenge for American democracy in this era. And we really do observe that at the state level. So this is the overall sort of empirical finding I'm going to be talking about today. This is democratic performance on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. And over time, this is just descriptive. States controlled by the Democratic Party, where both chambers of the legislature and the governor are Democratic in blue, divided states in green, in contrast to Republican-controlled states where both legislative chambers and the governorship are held by Republicans. There you see actually diminishing democratic performance over this time period. So what I'm going to try to do is justify the validity of this measure throughout this talk, and then talk about testing these various theories of why democracy expands or contracts. So there's been a tremendous history in American institutional and legal research around the idea of federalism as helpful or harmful to democratic performance in societies around the world, but especially in the US case. So once again, compared to even other federal institutional systems like Canada, India, Mexico, Switzerland, the US is especially decentralized. It puts especially large authority over democratic institutions like election administration, policing, districting, and so forth at the state level. We also know historically that white rule and white supremacy were historically enforced at the state level, and a pattern in which civil rights activists traditionally and historically called on the national government to come in and standardize civil rights across the states, whether in the slavery period or the Jim Crow period. But there's, I would say the dominant theory in American institutional research and legal research is that decentralization is beneficial for democratic performance, and that we observe state and local governments or devolving authority to them as helpful for democracy for a number of theoretical reasons. One is that decentralization brings representatives closer to their constituents, both geographically and culturally, right? Unlike those distant fat cats in Washington, you hear often in state and local campaigns, that it reduces national polarization to have conflictual issues like LGBT rights or abortion rights litigated at the state and local level and customized at this lower level, rather than battled in a country that's divided over that particular issue. The voting with your feet sort of threat of exit in political economy research is another tool that ordinary individuals, voters, investors, businesses can use to exit a state or locality that is extracting too many rents or otherwise producing bad governance. Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, coined the term that already existed conceptually, that decentralization allows for policy experimentation and laboratories of democracy, emulating positive, successful policy experiments, rejecting negative ones, and would it not be a shame if we only had one laboratory as opposed to 50 is the theory here. Finally, James Madison, going back to the Federalist Papers, argues that federalism provides a double security against autocracy. So if a would-be autocrat takes national power, for example, in the presidency, they're gonna have a hard time capturing 50 separate, or in Madison's time, 13 separate subnational institutions that themselves have their own constitutional authority. And you see this in sort of popular wonk political discourse all the time. So on the left, we have David Brooks. Federal power is impersonal, uniform, abstract, and rule-oriented. Local power is personalistic, relational, affectionate, irregular, and based on a shared history of reciprocity and trust. And on the right, we have Yuval Levin's book, The Fractured Republic, which really makes this argument that we reduce national affective polarization, in which, now parents don't want their child to marry somebody from the out party. We reduce that sort of affective polarization if we devolve these contentious issues to the state and local level. And those are some sort of, popular center-right commentators, but there's also a progressive version of this. Heather Gerken has a theory of progressive federalism that emphasizes that more when racial minorities and immigrant groups are able to be majorities within localities or majority minority districts, that enables descriptive representation and a positive form of representation that would be absent in a more centralized unitary system of government as many other industrialized countries have. But there's this alternative theoretical tradition that really suggests that decentralization is disadvantageous for democracy and may leave American democracy in particular at risk of democratic backsliding. And one prominent sort of tradition that has cast the state level as especially sort of holding back democratic performance is historical work on race and federalism. So again, the pattern from slavery through Jim Crow, through appeals for national legislation against lynching, for example, states and localities have de jure and de facto enforced white supremacy. And it's been the national government to come in with civil rights legislation, usually through Congress, occasionally through the Supreme Court, and occasionally through executive action. In addition, the political economist William Riker, not from Star Trek The Next Generation, Commander Will Riker, but the guy, the political economist, who was no radical, I would say. But he has a quote that I found in his 1964 book on federalism that I find fascinating. If one disapproves of racism, one should disapprove of federalism. All that federalism ever did was to facilitate the expression of racist beliefs and the perpetuation of racist acts. And he's concluding this after a cross-national sort of qualitative and game theoretic study of federalism around the world, really concluding that the particular decentralized American form of federalism overlapping with the racial geography of the US creates this really problematic pattern in terms of democracy and federalism. In addition, in especially the Trump era, I want to talk about the trade-off of decentralization, where certainly conditional on having a would-be autocrat in national power. Yes, you don't want centralized electoral institutions. However, long-term decentralized electoral institutions, states administer elections from local dog catcher up to president. So when an undemocratic coalition restricts democracy within a state, it affects representation throughout the system and can make it more likely for that would-be autocrat to take national power in the first place. So this is one side of the trade-off that I think over the past 6 or 7 years has not been emphasized. We have seen a lot of Madison's double security argument, which I think, again, conditional on national threats coming, that's really important. But over the long term, we may increase the probability of essentially would-be autocratic national takeover through decentralization and allowing for the manipulation of democratic institutions at the lower level. Finally, in my book, I go into more examples, housing policy, criminal justice policy, many other policy areas that show empirically and for theoretical reasons that actually concentrated interests, groups that have fewer individual members but tend to have more wealth at their disposal to use in politics, they are especially advantaged at lower levels. So we can think about in housing politics where older, whiter, wealthier homeowners dominate local meetings. And ironically, informationally, given the decline of state and local media, where voters know most is at the presidential level, right? That if we're really talking about making an informed vote. I myself, PhD in political science, have a tough time voting in state legislative primaries. I have an easy time voting in presidential primaries. And empirically, we just see a tremendous number of threats to democratic institutions happening over these past couple of decades, especially with respect to election administration, gerrymandering, and now the new threat of potential electoral subversion as well. But there is not yet a systematic measure, as there are cross-nationally, of democratic performance in the US states. And I hope this measure will be of use to a tremendous number of scholars for all sorts of empirical inquiries. So I follow these great cross-national comparativist scholars and the Polity and Brightline Watch and Varieties of Democracy in trying to create this quantitative measure. Democracy is a huge, huge concept, right? It's one of the most importantly debated normative theoretical concepts, right? So the first thing to do to get any conceptual traction on measuring democracy is to break it into subcomponents, right? Following normative democratic theorists. Today, I'm really focusing on that electoral, I'm not sure if my laser is gonna work, but the electoral component there is what I'm gonna focus on today, electoral democracy as the measure. But also I would argue that liberalism or liberal democracy is an important component of democracy, as well as many comparative scholars really suggest there's an egalitarian democratic component that's more related to theories of social democracy. But in my appendices of the paper I sent you, you can see additional measures that are based in those components. But today I'm really just talking about the straight up electoral democracy, election administration, security, and districting. So then next, I have to collect individual variable indicators of each of those components. So the indicators are individual quantitative variables. They can be of different types, binary, like yes, a state has same-day voter registration or no-fault absentee voting. They can be interval, a state can have a strict voter ID law, non-strict or none, or things like that. It can be continuous, like a measure of the efficiency gap in partisan bias and gerrymandering. So some examples, the efficiency gap is a gerrymandering measure from scholars like Chris Warshaw. Same-day voter registration. In the liberal component, I have variables like journalist protections for anonymous sources and not release them to the state, as well as some criminal justice measures. And in the egalitarian component, I use measures of actual material equality, like economic inequality. And there, I just want to really quickly say, if you think like the egalitarian component is the one stacked, as the sort of like left-wing one, I would note that the most unequal states is California, where I'm from. And actually, remarkably, like the partisanship maps on a little better to the electoral component even than the egalitarian component. We can come back to that in Q&A if you're interested. Here's how these indicators sort of aggregate up. So at the bottom we have, felon disenfranchisement, an indicator, and that aggregates up into that electoral democracy component. You can combine them all into one giant measure, but today, again, we're focused on the electoral component. Here's the list of all the indicators. The bold ones are the electoral ones. We can come back to this. I want to just move quickly and just show you in small font to dramatize like painstaking collection. Like we could come back to particular ones, but you'll see, absolutely happy to come back. To construct the quantitative measures, I use two sort of mainstream techniques. The first is just additive indexing, where you just weight everything equally and create a sort of average of, number of pro-democracy measures minus like undemocratic measures, get a composite measure that way through addition and multiplication. But also this allows, based in the Bayesian bootstrap, which is becoming more popular in measuring sort of statistical uncertainty now, it allows me to simulate many thousands of potential measures with different weights to satisfy people's various normative weights that they would put on different index. Some people might say vote by mail is much more important than another thing, or gerrymandering should be weighted down, right? These allow us to simulate many potential measures and look at the results they give. But the main measure is based in Bayesian factor analysis related to item response theory. What this means, just really quickly, what this means is that I am not giving any structure to how the measure should be developed. Rather, I'm asking a statistical model to create the democracy score for each state year that best predicts its pattern of actual observed democracy indicators. Okay, so this is latent dimension reduction, very similar to roll call voting scales like DW Nominate, which say take all of Congress's roll call votes and say, we're not going to impose structure on this. We're going to allow a statistical model to find the particular legislative ideology ideal point that best predicts any legislator's roll call votes in a session. So it's analogous to that. We can go through parameters if you'd like, again, in Q&A. But I'll show you how this ends up producing this measure. So these are factor loadings, more specifically the discrimination parameters in this measure, which show how much a given indicator increases a state's democracy score or reduces it. This is based on that statistical model, okay? So I did not choose these weights. The statistical model does, and it shows some indicators increase a state's democracy score, like having no fault absentee voting or a post-election audit is required after each election. Then there's some that have very little relationship to the measure. They don't make a state's democracy score change very much. Those are, for example, the percent of the voting eligible public that are registered, or the percent of provisional ballots that are end up being rejected. Then there are some indicators that reduce a state's democracy score, like felon disenfranchisement, the average in-person voting wait times, which is collected by the MIT Democracy Lab, or MIT Election Lab, does great data collection work. And some gerrymandering measures like the efficiency gap end up being some of the most powerful sort of negative items on this list. So you get a flavor of sort of how this model has constructed this overall state democracy index with respect to electoral democracy. So let's look at some trends based on this measure. So this is from that statistically derived measure of democratic performance. And here we can see a few types of states. Washington State, where I am now, go Huskies, in the dotted line up there. It starts towards the top of the distribution, and over time it gets, there's some fluctuations. It eases some voter registration along the way and remains generally a relatively top performer. In the dashed line, Texas, it's slightly below the median and fluctuates across time, but remains sort of a general below median Democratic performer. But then there's a set of states that are like North Carolina here, and North Carolina being the most prominent, that really fall off the cliff, that start towards the top of the distribution. And after 2010, see a huge cliff-like drop in their Democratic performance. And I'll say just The qualitative history of democracy in North Carolina is fascinating, where books like Pathways Out of Dixie by Rob Mickey really shows this was a state that its Jim Crow regime really was robust through the 1970s. Desegregation and enforcing the Voting Rights Act were very difficult, but by the 1990s, it was a leader in implementing the Federal Motor Voter Act, allowing registration at the DMVs, and was really a success story of increased partisan competition, massively skyrocketing voter turnout. It was really a hopeful story until this sort of period. So we should investigate more theories of why this might have happened in some states. So let's turn to some theories, some causal theories of why democracy might expand or contract. About how much time are we at?
Like 10.
Perfect. I think that's perfect. Thanks. So a first theory of why democracies, these are based in comparative research as well as research on the US case. Why would democracy expand or contract? One theory suggests that partisan competition might incentivize parties to find new voters. So Dawn Teal, in talking about how the franchise for women expanded state by state, she said in states that were really competitive, both parties were sort of clamoring over each other to find new voters and to be the ones to say, no, like we're gonna incorporate new women into our party. That creates positive incentives to expand democracy. But Francis Lee and others have sort of put forward a new counter theory that competition actually at elite levels may produce sort of scorched earth legislative tactics and various forms of brinksmanship. In her last two books, talking about how narrow congressional majorities have incentivized this type of scorched earth and even sometimes anti-democratic tactics. So partisan competition prediction can go either way, can increase or decrease democratic performance in a state. Polarization, we know this straightforward story from people like McCarty, Poole, and Rosenthal, or Ziblatt and Levitsky's How Democracies Die, right? Polarization erodes elite norms. It also increases the ideological cost of the other party taking power, right? If your ideological ideal point is more distant from them, it's way worse if they take power than if you are generally more in agreement ideologically with them. So polarization should reduce democratic performance. Demographic change and racial threat, huge behavioral literature in American race and ethnic politics research, as well as sociology and other disciplines. Demographic change and racial threat at the local level has appeared to produce sort of right turns on immigration and to some extent even on sort of attitudes towards the openness of democracy. We know this more recently with studies by people like Dan Hopkins, Ryan Enos, many others. But this goes back to, for example, Larry Bobo and Vince Hutchings talking about ethnic conflict within urban space. So an idea here is that a state experiencing demographic change, for example, an increase in the number of Latinos or percentage of Latinos in the population, may restrict democracy to avoid sort of empowering this new group of voters. Finally, there's a more historically, and I guess I would say, historical political economy theory that's based in what groups within society form national partisan coalitions. And this is focused on the national coalitions in a nationalized political moment like this. And these, going back to Dan Ziblatt's 2017 book on conservative parties, he really argues that conservative parties face a dilemma. They typically are the parties of the relatively wealthy in business. As economic inequality expands, their economic ideal point is going to be farther away from that of the median voter. This gives them incentives to not expand democracy too much. In addition, the Republican Party combines a sort of elite base that has some wealthy individuals and some forms of industry, particularly extractive industry, with an electoral base that's not interested in tax cuts, but is interested in the cultural and resentment-based politics of the Republican Party. So that combination, in addition, the Ziblatt book is really amazing, where it shows as inequality expands, parties that represent the relatively wealthy in their economic platform are going to have greater incentive to introduce other forms of political conflict in election appeals because their economic appeal will not be especially winnable in this situation. In other words, historically and around the world, you see therefore conservative parties entering into conflict around religious traditionalism, ethno-nationalism, and other forms like this. All of this is sort of buttressed and advantaged by advantageous electoral geography for the Republican Party. But this theory would just, to quickly summarize, control of a state by the Republican Party may reduce democracy in this theory. So let's see some empirics. Here, I'm doing a variety of difference in differences models in all of these. So these are within state change on the treatment variable like competition, and within state change on democracy, right? We're not comparing Mississippi to California, right? We're comparing Mississippi to Mississippi. And we can do some robustness checks in a few slides too, but the takeaway in this one is that competition has a modestly positive, not significant effect on democracy. So small point for the partisan competition theory expanding democracy. Higher values means greater increase in democratic performance. Polarization is a very clear zero finding. Polarization within states, as within California or Nevada or Idaho, as the Republican and Democratic parties within those states diverge, we don't see democracy changing in either direction, right? So this is not about changes to polarization within states. But I keep saying within states because there may be some other kind of polarization that might matter. Demographic change and racial threat. We can go into some extra slides and look at statistical models and diff and diff, but I just want to highlight the biggest 5 Democratic backsliding states: Alabama, North Carolina, Tennessee, Ohio, Wisconsin during this period, and highlight their demographic change over time. And what you should see here is that these states are not experiencing large demographic changes within states, right? Again, within North Carolina, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Ohio, it is not a massive, they have some Latino immigration, some Asian American immigration. It's not a massive change. These other states in the Southwest that are not big backsliders are seeing much more robust changes to their demographics. So it doesn't appear that within state racial threat, unlike Jim Crow, where Jim Crow was about racial conflict within states over land redistribution, public goods, segregation of public goods, right? This is quite distinct from Jim Crow. I'll come back to that. But that doesn't mean race is not central to the story. It means that this more localized racial conflict is not central to threats to American democracy at this moment. It clearly is about Republican control here. The effect there on the right, Republican control has a large and negative coefficient, really substantial, over half a standard deviation, which when a state becomes Republican, which is a large amount. I'll show a few sort of robustness checks of this, but the point I just want to emphasize in the next few slides, I really am trying to get rid of this effect through these robustness checks.
Yeah. I have a question, just in terms of thinking about what Republican control means, does that be like, both houses of the state legislature and governorship as well, and attorney general?
Not so, no attorney general in here, but
both houses and governor, both houses.
Exactly, governor and both houses, legislative chambers. Attorney generals are increasingly important in administering elections in Democratic, and many are elected. So that would actually be a great. We should write that. So if you're interested in the staggered timing diff and diff debates, we could skip over the stats. Some new stats, it's important to re-aggregate your treatment effects across different diff and diff windows, so there's not improper weightings across time. If effects change over time, maybe the GOP effect gets bigger as a state has held GOP control for longer, right? Again, the same effect here with this Callaway and Santana new diff and diff technique. Same thing with synthetic control, which matches states that will become Republican on their democracy scores to ones that will never become Republican based on similar democracy scores here, right? So in the pre-period, so we're trying to match them. We're creating like fake Wisconsins out of like, we have a mix of Indiana and North New Hampshire, and we're mixing them all to create a fake for each one that does become Republican, or to create a fake Wisconsin or whatnot. And then we're going to track that in a difference in differences model, the fake Wisconsin and real Wisconsin. And if you do that for every potential state that becomes Republican, you get this, and again, an even larger effect than we observed before, as after 6 years of Republican control, Democratic performance can go down by a standard deviation and a half on this measure, which is really quite massive. And again, going back to what I said before about simulating democracy measures, you might think, oh, Jake's measure, he has some things I don't like in it that I don't think are really central to democracy, and we can continue to talk about this. I simulate 100,000 potential measures with random weights. So you can have a preferred measure. It is in this distribution somewhere, okay? Any of preferred measure you may have of how to weight these different indicators. And what you see here is you run the diff and diff models 100,000 times, and I plot the coefficients and their distribution. And you see, again, with competition, polarization, still the same sort of results there, modestly positive for competition. Republican control, there's really no measure you can create that gets rid of that negative Republican effect. And I know, this is a tough thing to sell. This is really, really hard to get rid of if you really, in any sort of type of measure you construct. Okay, to finish up, so these new measures, I think, unlock new possibilities to test various classic theories of democratic expansion and contraction, competition, modestly positive, no role for polarization or demographic change on its own. But the control by the Republican Party does lead to democratic decline, especially on that electoral democracy measure. But I'll say on the liberal democracy measure, if you do focus on the carceral state and policing authoritarianism, it looks much more bipartisan. So that's actually an area I think PhD can't, if you have grad students and things, like somebody should do a dissertation, why so much partisan polarization in all types of policy areas. And I have a 2018 paper looking at across policy areas, which state policy areas have polarized since the 70s. Criminal justice and to some extent education are the unpolarized ones. The polarized ones, there's policy polarization now, healthcare with Medicaid expansion, climate policy, reproductive rights, marijuana, it goes on, but criminal justice is one where, I'm from California and I remember the 90s, and it's not polarized in the same way these other areas are. And it's becoming more clearly central to our understanding of democracy and civil rights in the US, so deserves a lot more further study. I'd love to talk with you all about potential policy implications of this. I do think, so currently the FEC just regulates campaign finance, but I do think we may need a full regulatory agency to at least set baselines for election administration and districting. And some of that was on the congressional agenda. It doesn't look like it's going to happen now, but I do think that falls from this. And you see now in the period after this measure, my measure seems to be predicting states that further do these things. So I think that in part validates the study. If after the time series ends, you can very much predict state behavior in the ensuing years. My book, Laboratories Out of Democracy, is out on July 5th, my parents' anniversary. So we're gonna have a double celebration. We're gonna split the celebration. And then, so the book also talks about how the nationalization of the parties, right? This national coordination of these party coalitions, right? I focused on the Republican coalition today, but the nationalization of both coalitions means that the laboratories of democracy theory no longer operates. States only emulate policies from states controlled by the same party. Wisconsin and Minnesota, both financial crisis hit them. It's not like, Wisconsin's over there looking, oh, what is blue Minnesota doing? Let's see if it works. Like, that is not how politics works anymore at the state level. And that really sort of lets the air out of some of the traditional, like centuries long optimistic theories of American federalism that now it does not correspond, it does not map on well to current group and partisan politics anymore. In addition, sort of advantages for concentrated interests at lower levels rather than higher levels. Thanks so much for your time. Go Warriors, we're in a crisis. We really got to have a good playoffs. Thanks.
Okay, that was going to have something to say. Apparently you're sitting here. We're trying to maximize what the camera sees. All right, so if you have a question, please put up your hand. I will take a list. Okay, one sec. I'll ask the first question in the meantime. And what do you have an extra pen by chance? I don't. Does anybody have an extra? Oh, thanks, Hakeem. So I'll ask the first question while you're answering. I will keep taking names, which is, Ziblatt also predicts that, great presentation, first of all, that the Conservative Party has an incentive to stop extremism and serves a really important gatekeeping function. So why is the National Party not doing that, especially after 2010? And please keep your hands up.
Should I answer? Keep going.
You can answer while I.
So I think that's an outstanding question. So I'd say, to summarize Ziblatt 2017, really it's that conservative parties are the pivot in democracy. That's really clear. When conservative parties decide to take some concessions, say, we can't get everything we want on our economic dimension. We have this potential incentive to introduce other forms of conflict that can really destabilize a society through, for example, producing ethnic conflict. They often don't in democracies. That is the point. When democracies persist, it's because they don't take that. And why they don't take that bait is there's forms of like elite beliefs and ideology and their role in history. I think there's also the sort of more Asimov and Robinson style. They think in the long run, it'll produce more, even though they get a smaller slice of the pie, essentially, by giving away some power to the masses, that the overall size of the pie will, over the long run, give them more than having a smaller pie that they dominate.
I have Larry first, and if everyone could just say briefly who you are or your name, that would be great. Thanks. All right, Larry.
Larry Diamond. So I have a narrow question and a larger question. The narrow question is, North Carolina plunged so low. I mean, it looks like an authoritarian state. It looks like it was at 15 or something on the electoral democracy scale, which, even though I'm pretty skeptical about the level of democracy in many of these states, seems implausible to me that it could be so low. So maybe you could just say how it wound up there. But the bigger question is why? So I have no trouble believing, and I think it's intuitively obvious actually to many of us, that there's a strong association now between Republican Party control and the decline of democracy in these states and, frankly, in the United States. But, why is this happening? Why has the Republican Party turned this way? And why are people voting for an authoritarian party? And I wonder, I'd like to offer a hypothesis that in the spirit of American federalism, maybe there's not one reason that historically, maybe this could be explained pretty simply in the southern states. They used to be authoritarian states, frankly, very authoritarian states until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Then they just flipped from being Democratic to Republican, but it's the same authoritarian culture, racial anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. Then the question becomes, why the other states? Why Wisconsin? And just final angle on that, I'm just wondering, I'm sure you've read Catherine Kramer's work about Scott Walker and the rise of all that, and Arlie Hochschild. So how you react to their kind of explanations of this?
Thanks so much. Outstanding questions. The first thing, your North Carolina question makes me feel like I missed saying something in the talk, which is that this dimension of democracy is much more democratic, and the range of the sort of democracy scale that I'm observing here, North Carolina being at the low end, is so small compared to the differences in democracy pre-1965 across states. The difference between Michigan and Alabama in 1960 is you cannot even begin to quantify compared to this. This is a much smaller range of democracy being fought over, and I think that's really clear. I would say, I think you put it really well, that there are some really troubling forms of democratic backsliding happening in the states, but this is absolutely worlds away from the differences between states in the Jim Crow period and the slavery period. I actually wonder how much we could create a composite quantitative measure that bridges these time periods where it would look like North Carolina versus California is like here, and then it'd be like 365 in a different universe. So I think that's exactly right. And I think we need to be clear about that, that analogies to the new Jim Crow can be good in explaining to some extent how racial politics and geography enter into this, but the analogy of the new Jim Crow, it's not accurate to say this is the level of authoritarianism of Jim Crow. Another thing is, so how did the GOP get like this? This is an ultimate question of like what defines how parties work. There's the Bonn et al. Sort of group-based competition within parties. There's that the voters at the mass level sorted and changed through, for example, racial realignment. You had a nice allusion to that. I would say my take, I guess, would be a combination. So racial realignment certainly does matter. Racial conservatives sorting into the Republican Party, not having the wide New Deal coalition of Southern Dixiecrats along with Northern Labor Democrats means that partisanship maps on to racial conflict now much more. I would say economic inequality does provide more incentives to engage in these style of racial conflict debates to avoid Mitt Romney lost on but granted, to his credit, he really said we're going to battle over regulating private equity, and that's going to be the terms of debate, not on is our country slipping away, and that's a different type of Republican Party. Why do people vote for it? I think one thing is economic voting has certainly declined in this period. I think the decline in some of my research, the decline of the labor movement has really opened up a place. So I have a paper with Paul Freimer and AJPS that the decline of the labor movement really gave an opening to racial resentment-based politics by not giving an alternative organizational identity to especially white workers. So when you combine that with the industrialization, I think you do get an opening for elite appeals to racial and immigration-based conflict and sort of general own the libs style appeals. So that, and I think also in terms of democracy, there's some other good behavioral work coming out, experimental and otherwise, that people don't vote based on institutional design and procedure, they vote based on outcomes and values. So people are not actually going to vote that much on protecting democracy. It's unfortunate. I would love everybody was a deep, normative theorist of democracy in their vote, but they're going to vote based on, identities and economics. So that's something to be aware of. And I think just to focus on elite conflict around this. And then why the Midwest? That's such Kathy Kramer, Arlie Hochschild. I think the Kathy Kramer, this is another thing. I'm a quant who really does appreciate this type of qualitative, ethnographic, and interview-based research. I think she was ahead of the game. She was ahead of all the quants on this by saying there is this rising resentment-based politics that has various dimensions of it. There's a racial dimension. There's an sort of liberal intellectual, anti-Madison, Wisconsin resentment-based dimension to this. And all of that is part of the conservative movement. And I'd also say then I gotta stop with this. The last thing is technological change, structural technological change, the decline of, for example, state and local news and the rise of a national, especially conservative media sphere, but it's also true that I would say the effect on liberal or mainstream media would be to move it towards horse race style sensationalism and away from essentially inquiries into how people are living, how policy interacts with their lives and material realities. And that's been a bad trend for democracy as well. Thanks for those. And great to see you. I saw you on Zoom a couple of times.
Next on my list is Steve, Hans, and Frank. Did you have your hand up or no?
No.
Okay, then Brett. So Steve.
Steve Stedman. I follow all of your music.
No, that's why. No, that's how I got the invite.
I'm also a big fan.
Thanks.
This is great talk and great work.
Thanks.
Let me just say two things. One is, I guess I'm unhappy with the demography as your measure or your indicator for likely racial backlash. I mean, backlash is usually it's a very subjective sense of threat, fear, and you needn't have any objective change in terms of democracy to get the politics of racial backlash. In fact, the North Carolina example was pretty interesting to me, just in the story that you told, right? Why would you get more racial backlash? Well, because it actually started to look like a democratic place where Blacks were empowered, right? And it's the empowerment, not the democracy, it's the empowerment, right? That's creating the backlash. And then, it could be just complete, it's like causation is not correlation, but that fall off cliff is Obama being elected, right? So just, are there other ways that you can get it other than just relying on the demographic change?
Outstanding point.
And then the second one is, so this goes to my own work over the years on how to do elections with integrity. Almost everywhere around the world, you don't have partisan election management. And in this country, we do everywhere. We have partisan election management. And somehow we've ridden along on American exceptionalism that somehow, well, we can professionalize it. And it doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat who's the Secretary of State, it really doesn't matter. And even this back at the beginning when debates about the John Lewis bill, all this stuff about how we're going to change stuff, everybody's giving a free ride really to the fact that Secretary of States run elections and it's still going to be partisan. And they always fall back on, well, they're always professional. Right? That hasn't been a problem. Except we are now in an era where people know that's the locus. If you want to control election, we got to get our Republican, not just a neutral Republican, a good civil servant. We have to get our Republican. So I think your scores are just going to plummet even more precipitously.
Thanks so much. It's, outstanding insights. I'd say the first thing on empowerment, that's exactly right. Like maybe demographic change at best is a proxy measure of empowerment, but certainly you're right. The theory would be political empowerment produces threat. So I think there's some good studies of this, and I'm actually got a grant. I'm very happy got this grant to study, for example, the effect of the Voting Rights Act on institutional change in southern cities. So the move of more offices out of elections and the rise of city managers as potentially a result of places that have had some proportion Black that could comprise maybe a majority coalition with liberal whites. Those places after the Voting Rights Act enfranchises those Black voters will produce this institutional insulation and backlash that would probably be a better measure of this racial threat hypothesis than like, more Latinos, so I think that's right. The second thing then in the middle, you said that North Carolina drop, Obama being elected, that's true, but it's also a redistricting year and the gerrymandering measures really do matter. And gerrymandering, real mathematicians, Joe A. Chen, Chris Warshaw, people who are in the real deriving new ways to simulate districts and things, the quotes are like the North Carolina 2010 map is mathematically the most partisan bias in US history. We don't actually know that, even going back, there's some records going very far back, and there was malapportionment prior to the big Reynolds v. Sims and Baker v. Carr and things like that. You could actually set legislative districts, like in California too. There's like a town, LA County had one state legislator, and a town of like 112 people had its own state legislature. That was banned. But in terms of actual partisan bias, this is by far the record. Court cases have come in and actually made it so the new 2020 maps will be, I think, at the US House level will be about even, at the state legislative level will be biased Republican, but certainly not as much as the 2010s. So those scores, but then these other things that we're talking about will continue to push scores downward as I collect new data there. But the partisan management, I think gerrymandering is a great example of how the nonpartisan commissions have been effective in producing less partisan bias in maps, and where you draw these elites that themselves probably have some partisan identity, and you guys would be experts on how to find, people with principle and things like that. But I think it does appear to be a pattern that these commissions are a lot more effective than a partisan legislature.
Hans?
Yeah, hi, my name is Hans. I'm a postdoc here.
Hi, Hans.
So Larry actually asked, most of the questions that I wanted to ask, but I think I can keep it relatively short. I find like this drop that you show in North Carolina super striking. And I was also wondering if you can compare this to like developments elsewhere, and I'm more interested in like compare this like with other parts of the world. So this drop that you observe in North Carolina doesn't mean that, you know, it moves say from like Norway to Italy or to Hungary or to Turkey, or like I think it would be really cool to like compare it to like other countries. And then my other question is on this like finding on, you know, you said that when a state becomes Republican, that like the democracy for declines. And I'm wondering if these effects are like even across all kinds of states, or is it like driven by, you know, competitiveness at the national level or anything else?
Nice, thank you, Hans. So the comparative politics angle, so there's some subnational democracy measurement, sort of like mine in a slightly more limited way in federal systems like Argentina, one in India. They tend to measure it at a snapshot in time, but that would be an absolute like social science dream to map these on the same scale. So if you know from thinking about studies of responsiveness, are ordinary voters getting their policies they want? Like you have to put them on the same scale somehow, right? And the votes that come up in a legislature are going to be very different than asking somebody what they want out of policy, right? So for that reason, there's a lot of challenges, but I think in the longer term, that would be the best possible thing to do is measure subnational democracy. The other thing I'll say is varieties of democracy and polity in these cross-national measures, they tend to have like one variable indicator within them, like quality of subnational democracy. And that it's like done through expert coding and surveying, and I don't quite understand it, but like there's been no, in the US, it's like just a flat line. It's always been perfect. So I'm like, it's fine, but you should see a blip in like 1877. So we have some work to do on those as well.
Who Rothstein collected a data set, subnational data set for Europe.
Nice. Based in like Germany and
for
other.
For the whole of the EU.
Amazing. He's based in Sweden. That figures they have amazing data.
He's retired now.
Can you remind me the name?
Rothstein.
Oh, gotcha. Thank you.
There you go.
And then the Hans, your other question of which type, are there more than just, you know, Republican control, which types of states? So another interesting thing on this, maybe again, demographic change is not the best way to measure racial threat, but actually, if anything, the Republican states that are a little more Latino or becoming a little more Latino are less backsliding than the other Republican states is one small finding. I wouldn't like put a huge amount behind that. And then occasionally, because there are many simulated measures and robustness checks, if you look in the paper I sent you, if you look in the appendix, there is with the additive index rather than the Bayesian modeled index, it does look like the ones Republican states becoming more competitive, like Florida, do backslide a bit more. And you can see that qualitatively in Florida, the battle over the felon disenfranchisement. First, it was a ballot initiative, and then the legislature sort of says, no, we're not going to allow this. And that did seem to be about competition, like very close Rick Scott gubernatorial elections, felon disenfranchisement. We know in research, like, it's hard enough to get anybody to vote. Like, it doesn't affect outcomes that much. So what is the real push to stop ex-felons from voting? And it probably is something about competition.
Right.
Yeah, Jake, I really enjoyed the presentation. That's
right.
super fascinating. Would you mind going back to, I think it was maybe like your second slide, when you displayed kind of the aggregate party level trends since 2000?
I think you might have to click on here. Yes.
The second slide?
Yeah, I think it was the second or it was just
the
aggregate party level.
Yeah.
My index.
No, keep going. Yeah. A couple more. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So So the data starts in 2000.
Right.
So I guess I'm kind of curious, what would happen what do you think would happen if you extended it back, further, right? And even just like a decade. So this sort of headline finding about the Republican control, it's compelling and it sort of like grabs attention and it speaks to something that I feel like we kind of all already know, right? But and this kind of gets back to the first question. I can't sort of help but wonder to what extent like this is an interactive effect with something else, and if you had sort of extended it back maybe like a decade for whatever reason, kind of post like 1965 Civil Rights Acts, maybe the effect would have been perhaps like less overwhelming.
Great.
And then I sort of to me like I look at this and there is the kind of post maybe 2010 2011 effect, right, which might represent gerrymandering, which kind of is consistent with your discrimination parameter results, but it also looks kind of like a secular kind of long-term trend too, right? And so I would like love to know like when in some sense like this kind of began, to what extent, yeah. I
think this is great. So I want to say, for the rest of this is a new.
And I feel like it's like an unfair question because like everything you've done like before yours.
I think this is actually one of the most important questions, and it's really unique. This particular moment in politics is very unique. Overall, Democrats have on average been the gerrymanders like throughout American history. And then also when you think about resistance to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act implementation and enforcement, like that's mostly Democratic. And one interesting thing is at the state level, we talk about racial realignment, like Eric Chickler's book, and thinking about partisan sorting and how the South became Republican. At the state level, it's so much slower. Mississippi's legislature is Democratic, and Arkansas are Democratic through the 2000s in many cases. So one interesting thing is it's actually maybe not, it's maybe, depending on we don't have great understanding of the voters' opinion on democratic institutions, and people don't think that deeply about them, but like it is potential that this is coming into alignment. It's actually this weird Democratic Party that controlled the South that actually had these ties to the Northern civil rights and labor Democrats in Chicago, Detroit, New York, California. And that partisan, they were held back from some things due to their national incentives within the party. And then,
I guess I'm just kind of curious. All right, so I have roots in South Carolina, really quick. I have roots in South Carolina, and so the Dixie Croats, in some sense, were still losing in like 1980, right? Right. And so I guess I'm kind of curious to what extent this is like kind of a 2-decade kind of like late crossing of sort of kind of the partisan sort of lines, right? And maybe to what extent maybe like sort of the Democrats were actually sort of like pre-2000.
No, I don't know. I think if you go back a little bit further, like that's absolutely going to be the case. The 1970s is the only time both parties in the North are competing for Black votes, like really in U.S. history. Like I think, and that was in some parts like on my mom's side, my great aunt desegregated or integrated a Chicago suburb in I think maybe late 60s, early 70s, and had a cross burned, and the Republican Party like called and reached out, like they were really Northern civil rights Republicans, and it's a different era. I think the demise of like competitive Northern Republicans may explain that effect just as much.
All right, so in our final 15 minutes or so, I have Marcel, Marissa, Eric, and Johannes. Did I miss anyone? Adam, sure. So this corner, I guess Marcel, or whoever wants to start.
So a few times, my question is about probably studies with other kind of parts of the world. So, and I was thinking about rules about proportional voting, for instance. Only the European countries have far-right parties, but they don't often end up in government. And when they do end up in government, they are in coalition governments, and as a result, they're anti-democratic tendencies are kind of unchecked. So
I love that. That's my kind of question.
And then the other thing is something I've heard. Again, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist, but I remember somebody mentioning that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have different rules about how you can compete in in the primaries, and so I remember reading that people were arguing that the Republican Party in 2016 had rules such that somebody could basically do an IPO of the party. And so that would not be possible in a proportional system. I mean, because the party would have an ideology, it would stick to that ideology, there would be some shifts over time, but it would not just go quickly overboard.
I think one takeaway from this, among other recent research in American democracy, is absolutely one thing is this: the rise of these national partisan coalitions does not translate well into the legacy of 1787 highly decentralized institutions, and should, like, the US would be much better off with a PR system in terms of voting for this reason. Potentially, one thing is to not reduce policy and politics to one dimensional conflict, right? There now seems to be multidimensional conflict in the mass public, but it gets smashed at the elite level into one dimension. Another thing of the geography of the US, meaning some votes are so inefficient, depending on where you live. And all, from California, like, you're not gonna get a lot of competitive elections nationally. The president candidates are not going to come here asking for your vote very much. Like, PR is really crucial for that reason as well. But you're also talking about this within the US. There's been a number of policy changes that have taken away power from the central party organizations to, like, sort of aligned groups around them. So one could think of, on the Democratic side, various progressive funders and groups around it, the Republican, like the Kochs, the chambers of commerce, like, and they, through campaign finance changes, have a lot more ability to sort of direct where the party goes rather than strategic party-based operatives. So that reinvigorating party organizations rather than sort of aligned interest organizations would also be an interesting thing. And there is quantitative research now that Citizens United, even, for example, has really changed the Republican Party at the state level in this way.
Marissa?
Hi, I'm Marissa Kellum. I'm a visiting scholar here.
Great to meet you,
and
Marissa.
I will be presenting in a few weeks very similar findings, but cross-nationally. Nice. And so that leads me to a few questions. First of all, who are they? Do you think backsliding just happens in the States, or is somebody doing it? Like, who's the actor here? And you mentioned the ideology of the Republican Party, the conservative ideology. What about this shift from, to populism? So is it being conservative, or is it this populist disregard for liberal institutions? And then my final sort of line along this is, you looked at your big finding is that the Republican Party control, but you compare it to, say, polarization and competition. Might those be post-treatment effects? That is, the Republicans' control is polarizing. Which comes first? That actually leads to less competition. So, how do we disagree?
No, that's crucial. And in studying it, like, I am like a causal inference-based quant. So it's like, it's very clear that these things interact in feedback processes, and the true model would not have an exogenous partisan control treatment. Even if you believe changing the democracy score itself affects who then takes power the next cycle. There's so many feedbacks in this way. So I would consider this sort of a first cut, and where I'm taking a little liberty to call things exogenous to each other, which they clearly are not. And we just had to talk about, competition in Florida and how that interacts with partisanship and democracy. I think that's great. On sort of right-wing populism, I think that is this, these concepts are hard to define, but I would say, so I really like the way Hacker and Pearson have proposed this concept of plutocratic populism, where it is clear, it seems that actually some of the drive does come from the need to maintain this coalition of high-end tax cuts along with winning votes, winning in the mass public, where that's not a viable strategy without things like moving towards a more populist messaging on immigration, for example, breaking the elite consensus of the George W. Bush, I like low-wage immigration, rancher or whatever, and the sort of democratic liberalism around immigration, breaking that to gain more votes because there's no other way really to maintain the economic platform as the major sort of voting appeal. So that's where plutocratic populism comes in, and you get a fascinating set of Republican elites now where you see fake populist stuff happening all over from people who are, you know, Goldman Sachs VPs into government. And then, you know, I'm sick of these. It's amazing. Like, it's fascinating to watch. And that's really, I think, crucial. And it explains our time. I think another thing about the changing technological and industry space, though, is that leaving office now, you can get a job at Fox News in a way you couldn't before. So the incentives to be a long institutional statesman type of a like mainstream conservatism, that has died, and it's even hard. Like, it's more appealing to probably end your career and become part of the populism part of this. So I think you hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
Eric.
With Fox News as an exit strategy, it's really depressing. I enjoyed your talk, Eric Jensen from the law school and CDDRL. Lawyers are only supposed to ask questions at trial that they know the answers to. And I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm really interested in your speculation because you've been so deep into the data on what moves the needle. So your statement that people don't vote on institutional design, I completely agree with, but I wonder if there's, being in the business of hope, trying to construct hope in developing countries, I wonder if there could be a Ukraine effect on the US public, seeing that, yes, maybe democracy is an institutional framework does matter.
I like that. That already makes me feel better. So I really appreciate that. So I think that's right. And I would say there's other glimmers of hope around institutions too, where, you know, it's really hard to, there's just a cottage industry of consultants and things trying to parse out why people have voted the way they have in these recent elections and what messaging appeals will be best. But I would say, looking at, for example, the 2018 midterms, there was a tremendous amount of rhetoric, including in the mass public, and I'd say more, you know, various party bases and things like that, but also within, to some extent, corporate America, like the early pledges to not donate to Stop the Steal Republicans, which have waned away a bit. Research from Zali and others have showed that the pledges were temporary, but they did exist for a bit. So civil society like that, universities, corporations, that matters. I think there's some increase in voters' perceptions of what, you know, Black voters in the South obsessed with voter suppression as that is a top, if you actually ask, like that becomes a top issue area of concern for the first time since the civil rights movement. So I think those are glimmers of hope. Whether they really, if we were to interrogate deep down, it's like, oh yeah, I don't actually care about this. It's really about, like, you know, other subsequent rights that democracy would produce for, you know, the coalitions and groups I support and things like that. Maybe that's a deeper behavioral question, but I think you're right. I think there is some renewed interest in institutions and democratic institutions.
All right, Johannes and Adam, could we combine your questions and please try to keep them short?
Okay, I have coming from a country, Germany, we have 1,000 years of structure, so it would be interesting to know. By the way, one conclusion is just as an observation, what we learned, you know, that right wing in the person of the Nazis came to power in a legal way. So the electoral system plays a key role, and that was the conclusion taken after World War II. So the guy who is supervising elections nowadays in Germany is the president of the Federal Statistical Office, not a politician. This is the Federal Statistical Office, the president. So a top civil servant, but not a politician. He is running and the final responsibility for organizing elections. And this is a fundamental different approach. That's a lesson we learned, I think, from if too much is political, you know, then you can end up in a difficult, I think, situation. So the other issue, there are other observations I don't want, because what we see in Germany, maybe one remark is that trust in the population as far as politics is concerned depend, of course, to a large extent, what can politics really bring about in critical situations. We have seen that in the refugee crisis. We see that now in the pandemic. And we see always that the performance is not sufficient. Trust in politics in the country is really going down.
Absolutely.
So the overall performance, what you said, really, I think, in our observation, plays really absolutely critical. But the question I have is maybe one, and this was just an observation because this is maybe also interesting. You're discussing that very much from in the United States approach, but federalism is not just exclusively something for the United States. That is, we have 1,000 years with that. A good program, I think, about this experience. So, but the observation is, you did not talk very much about economics. Mm-hmm. So, and I was asking myself, we have seen that also in Europe, the globalization, I think, really played, in my view, a key role because it reinforced there was very favorable conditions on the two coasts, I think, of the United States. But in the middle, was pretty. And then I think something became really, you could feel that the lack of education, because people could change their jobs. Is that?
Yeah, no, I'm with
wait,
you.
Hold on. We're going to take Adam's question too. Adam?
I can take it offline.
No, please.
Well, go for it. One quick point first is to Steve's point. If you look at Secretary of State's offices, Secretary of State, they're the most polarized elected officials.
Wow.
If you put them in the legislature, they'll probably be the most polarized legislature in the country.
Ooh, send me that data.
And so, to the question about what happened with GOP, a related point, sort of like these racial threats or these generational threats that these states are facing. So, like Republicans in Georgia, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, those states have pretty much the highest age polarization, right? And so they seem to be the most aggressive at the moment in pushing back. You don't see the same type of energy in, say, Wyoming, where you don't see that same dynamic. So I wonder if that has something.
That's fascinating.
Like what you can hear.
I like that a lot. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna get that data. On the Germany stuff, just really quickly, I would say, so first, I love Federal Statistical Office. That's like my dream job. That's what it is.
Cool. I didn't say that. Not my dream job.
But I would say, so German federalism, again, I'm not a comparativist, not an expert. I'm a dumb area studies and of one guy. But I would say federalism, they much more interregional redistribution within German federalism. So across the East and West now, much more redistribution. There is much less of these democratic institutions at the provincial level. Much more is done through the central government. So I would say, yes, both federal institutional structures, but the US form is just a very extreme case. But on economics, I absolutely think it's true. It's the interaction of, you cannot take away the post-1970s economic transformation of the US. That's so obvious, and it interacts with all of these other things. We had this debate, racial resentment versus economic anxiety. Let's put them both in a regression. Which coefficient is larger? Like, it is clearly, there's a great new piece, Gavin Wright at GSB, others, great new pieces on it. NAFTA, deindustrialization, globalization interacts with sort of rising racial threat, and elites know this is who took your jobs. Like, this is a classic. So we can get out of that, the new horse race, and talk about how globalization, deindustrialization produces fertile ground. And in my case, the demise of labor unions in the US has really left fertile ground for resentment.
It's pretty similar. Decline of trade unions.
We have one guy who need to wrap up. So do you want to answer Adam's question?
With Adam's question, I was saying, high five, please. I'm going to get your estimates of secretaries of state and the age polarization thing. Yes, I 1,000 times agree. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Jake. Thank you. For the Zoom audience and for everyone here, next week, EJ Dion and Miles Rappaport will be discussing their new book, 100% Democracy, about universal mandatory voting in the United States, if you're interested in American politics. And also, you have an N of 50. We clearly just saw that. Not an N of 1.